Everybody, this is Matthew Poes with Poes Acoustics, and in this video I am reviewing a screen. I've now actually had this for quite a while. This is from Seymour Screen Excellence, which is the integrator line from Seymour Screens, or Seymour AV, I think is the other line they have. But anyway, Seymour Screen Excellence is a partnership between a UK company called Screen Excellence and Seymour, Chris Seymour, to introduce those screens here. They are manufactured here, but the fabric that he uses, the Neo fabric, actually comes from Screen Excellence and is not shared with the other line. He has some similar fabrics, but they're not the same, and this is actually a better fabric. So I've done some video and pictures that I'll show you so you can see the texture, but the neat thing about this fabric is that it's a highly acoustically transparent fabric with a very smooth texture. So when you use a 4K projector, the grain of the screen doesn't interfere at all with the very small pixel size that you get from the 4K image. It was introduced when 4K projectors started to become more ubiquitous and allowed for a better looking picture. Acoustically transparent screens are pretty standard in the work that I do. And the reason is because if you don't use an acoustically transparent screen and you look at this space behind me here, what you'll find is that the only place you could stick the speakers would be the wrong locations for optimal sound. If I was to place the left and the right speakers outside of the screen, which is what would be necessary, one of the problems that I would run into is that they would be very close to the sidewalls. And in fact, this screen is a little bit small for the room. That happened as a result of a door that's in the way, and I may actually increase the screen size in the future just to play around with improving viewing angles. But the viewing angles nowadays that we're shooting for are closer to 50 and as much as 60 degrees. There are, in fact, some rooms where people really like to get as high as 70 degrees, which to me is the upper limit of what I'd ever be comfortable with and is pretty high. But 50 degrees is, I think, the correct viewing angle with 4K images. And remember, we're moving past 4K quickly. So I say 50 degrees, that's where we're at kind of today. I do think in terms of how much of your field of view that it fills, that's pretty close to as much as I'd want to do, but 60 probably as much as I'd want to do. The point is, if I was to go any bigger, the speakers would actually have to be right up against the sidewalls, and that would be problematic. Then you've got the center channel. So the center channel has to go, you can't see it, I'm not showing this right, but the center channel would actually have to go below the screen, and it would be only about a foot off the ground. So you'd have reflections that are coming right off the ground. You'd have sound quality issues because the speaker would be well below your ear level, aiming up, and it would cause voices to do this kind of smiley face, where basically you hear the left and the right at the right height, but the center channel causes it to dip. And so to me, it doesn't sound right. I've never liked it. The moment I understood this, I switched to acoustically transparent screens and have never looked back. All the people I work with in the industry all use acoustically transparent screens. We don't actually do non-acoustically transparent screens unless it's a specific request from the client or there's a particular reason we need to. So for me, finding an acoustically transparent screen that, one, is acoustically transparent enough to not actually interfere with sound, and it can be EQ'd back and corrected back to good sound on its own, and two, does not lose so much light that you lose too much brightness, basically. These two requirements make it difficult to find a good screen. The Neo fabric is rated at around 0.9, I believe, for the gain. Now, I didn't measure it. I can't speak to whether that's true, and I've actually talked to a couple of experts in the industry to find out what it would take to measure that, and have been told that that's easier said than done. You know, there's people who do it, but often don't do it correctly without realizing it. And so when I talked to Jason Dustle, for instance, and I talked to Kevin Miller, these are two, for people who don't know, these are top guys in the industry, especially, no offense to Jason, but Kevin is like way up there in the industry. He was a founding member of ISF along with the others that were involved in that. And what they told me was it can be done. It's just that you've got to be very, very careful. You've got to make sure you're using the right materials. They need to be a very particular type and the right. You can't just like hang stuff up on a wall and measure it and say, this one compared to this one is this difference in light, therefore it's this gain. That doesn't give you the right number. So it does need to be done correctly against a proper reference standard in a proper room with the right equipment. Enough so that Jason, when I had said to him, could you come over, we'll get the reference sample and do it, he wasn't comfortable doing that. So we have not measured this, but what I can say is that I recently completed a review of some Christie projectors. These are very bright projectors. And actually, one of the things I've learned is that the brighter the projector, the more problems with a screen show up. So often screens look okay, and then you stick like twice the nits on it, and all of a sudden things look, the grain is noticeable. There's some moire effects, things like that. So the screen looked perfect with the Christie projector. There were no issues, but when we were shining that 350 nits on it, we had to turn the projector way, way down. So while I don't know what it actually is, we do know what this projector has been able to do in the past based on its brightness on other screens of known gain. And we were seeing numbers that were consistent enough to suggest it probably is in the ballpark of that 0.9 number. So it's got good gain to it for an acoustically transparent screen. Good because a lot of the competition is actually more like 0.7. So this is reflecting back more light. Color accuracy wise, it's good enough that it's easily correctable. There's no perfect screens. There are some that are much better than others, but there are some that are actually quite problematic, and it requires a lot of correction to get it right. This screen material, we've never had any issues calibrating for it. So from a calibration standpoint, it's as neutral as it needs to be. And from an acoustically transparent standpoint, which is like a big challenge, it works very well, including you actually want quite a bit of distance between the screen and the speakers to get the best sound. The reason for it, which isn't always intuitive to folks, is that think of it as there's a certain number of fixed pores or openings per square inch of screen material. You take the sound wave. Remember, that sound wave expands at a rate that is basically each doubling of distance is 4 times the area. So think about how much of the sound wave energy is seeing pores. The farther away the screen material is, the more pores there are, and the more of the total sound energy is hitting pores instead of the little, basically, fibers between the pores. And so ideally, you'd want anywhere from 1 to 3 feet between the screen material and the speakers to get the best sound and the least amount of interference. Well, that's often really difficult. Like in my room, if I was to actually try to get the screen 3 feet out from the speakers, I'd have a big problem, which is that the screen would have to sit way into the room, actually pretty close to where I'm standing, and we'd only have about a 6-foot viewing distance to the chairs. It would be very much not optimal. So there's no easy way to do that. We wouldn't, in fact. And many rooms are the same way. This is about a 18.5 foot long room. So this is not an uncommon size for us. So we wouldn't want to do that, right? So in my particular case, because of having to hide subwoofers and everything, we actually only have about 2 or 3 inches between the face of the speaker and the screen material. There's a little bit of extra space because of the waveguide and the dome of the drivers, so call it 4 inches, maybe 6 inches max between the drivers and the, where the point source, if you will, is, and the screen material itself. And in those situations, you get a lot more comb filtering, and there tends to be more absorption. It causes more problems. And so having a good material that's easy to work with becomes really important. And this material has been very easy to work with. We've had no real issues with it. So I've been able to compensate, not just in my room. I use this fabric on every project I do, unless somebody requests something else. Because this is just, I know it works. I'm familiar with it. I really like Chris. So one of the things that's important to me is I want a product that works well and performs well. I want a company that I can rely on, and I want people that I enjoy working with to be a part of that. Because what happens when you come to me and you say, I need a screen, and I say, okay, I call it in, and then you say, by the way, I need it tomorrow. Well, you're not going to get it tomorrow because these are made to order. But in many cases, I would have to go back to you and say, it's 6 to 9 weeks. I'm sorry. With Chris, he'll work with you. He's not going to do this all the time. He's not going to, he's got to be able to keep things going, and he can't always constantly, but he charges a little bit extra. It's a rush fee. You pay the rush fee, and his guys will put in the extra effort to get this done for you, and he's met those for me, and he's just a good guy. It's a good company. The other people that work with him are all good people. And so having a company that's full of good people that produce a really excellent product that's made really well, I think leads to it being my go-to product, and one that I would recommend to anybody. I've actually used the acoustically transparent fabrics from pretty much every other brand, either because somebody else spec'd it and that's what they used, and so I get some time with it, or because we've tried it just to see. And what I can say is this has consistently been as good or better. I don't want to overstate and say that this is better than every other fabric on the market. It's not. There's a number of companies I've worked with whose fabrics appear to be very similar. They have a similar texture, which is very hard to see. They're acoustically transparent to a similar degree. The frames are roughly the same quality. And so I don't want to pretend like this is better than everything else. It's not, but it's at least as good. I haven't really found a product that I think is superior to this. And so that's really good, right? The frame on mine is the reference frame. They offer different series of frames. The reference is supposed to be the nicest of the frames, although it's the most limited for features. And what I would say is it's consistent with other nice frames. So I've had cheap projection screens. I've had good projection screens. I've done DIY. This is a nice screen. The frame is better than most. But again, it's not better than other similar quality frames. But like that's kind of the thing, right? We want to at least be as good as the ones coming out of companies like Stewart, Elite, etc. So this is definitely in the ballpark of the higher end screens that I've seen from other brands. And I think at least as good. The only thing I'm going to pick on Chris for is I think his little nameplate is kind of hokey. I think that the nameplates from the other companies are nicer than his nameplate, but that's a dumb reason to not like a screen. If he could up the quality of that nameplate a little bit, make it a little bit fancier, maybe that would be cool. But I don't think most of you care, right? And I don't really either. It's just I remember opening up the box on the first time I ever did one of these screens myself, and I saw the nameplate. And previous to that, I had been using screens from SI, Screen Innovations, and they have a nicer nameplate. And I've done some with, what is the brand? I'm going to forget it. Anyway, some of the other high-end brands and have found Stewart. That's what I was trying to think of. Stewart has a little bit nicer nameplate that they put on as well. So I think if Chris, I don't have a problem with the actual letters and colors and everything. It's more the way, like it just looks like a metal plate that's been kind of painted and thrown on. But so if it was a little nicer nameplate. He uses, I believe it's Velio. So he uses a really good black velvet for the frame material. When you've got, I mean, just in general, and you can kind of see it on the edge there, it's totally black looking when light is shined on it. So when you do overscan with the projector, which is common, it's hard to square them up perfectly. So you tend to overscan at least a tiny little bit just to make sure everything looks good. You don't notice it. It completely absorbs the light, which is what you want. Not all screen frames are made equally in that regard. There are some that use a lower quality velvet, and they do tend to be a little bit more reflective. So he's done a good job using a premium velvet there. As I said, they're all made to order, so whatever size you need. Like this is 114 inches wide. That's not a standard size he makes, but I told him the width I needed. He said no problem, and they made it. So that's really good. Now, Seymour Screen Excellence also offers motorized screens. So they obviously the motorized roller, but they actually make screens that do electronic masking. And we use those screens quite a bit. They're among my favorite because they're the most low profile of the screens that I've used, at least for masking. They are constantly doing their own motor controllers. They design them in-house. I've actually seen the development work happen. I mean, they do a really good job developing those controllers in-house to be very good and trying to stay ahead of everybody else's as best they can. Their mechanisms are good. The way they work is good. We found them to be good. Obviously, the biggest negative with those is they tend to be more expensive by quite a bit. Like it's not like a little bit more money. It's 2, 3, 4 times more expensive to get into motorized masking. That's not unique to Seymour Screen Excellence, though. Every company's masking screens tend to be priced in the same range. So they're competitively priced with the competition. But again, they're a good company to work with, and they can kind of custom do what you need within reason. The masking panels that go over are acoustically transparent. So if you have your speakers on the edge here, and then it has to mask in on the sides, it is firing through an extra piece of fabric that maybe needs to be compensated for, but it's still an acoustically transparent fabric. It's not solid. That's a good feature they have. They can do two-way masking, which can be either side masking or top and bottom masking, or they can do four-way masking, which would be both at the same time and allows basically any aspect ratio you want. They do offer other screen materials, and one of the materials, which reminds me a lot of like outdoor roller shade material, I think that actually is what it started as, but it's been optimized and customized for screen purposes, can work in a larger screen. So the Neo, I don't remember what the number is, but the Neo has a limit to how big it can go before you can't use it anymore. I believe the fabric just can't handle maybe the tension before it starts to rip itself apart from the tension. Chris could tell you exactly what the issue is, but I know there's a limit to how big you can go, and then when you get bigger than that, you got to get away from the Neo and move into the other ones. That limit has never actually been a limit for the rooms I do, unless it's a really, really, really big room. Like we have had some that would have 300-400 inch screens. You can't use the Neo on a screen that large. It might actually even be a size limitation of the material. It may not actually be a strength issue. But the other material, I think when you get to be screens that large, that other material works well. It's more of a woven material that, it would, if you were close to it, it would have a visible texture, but when you're far enough away, in the rooms I'm thinking of, I think the closest seating distance would probably be somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 25 feet. That's the closest seat. And then the optimize. All right, everybody. So I am going to continue what I was saying. I apologize for that little interruption in the video. My cat had apparently gotten out, so I had to take off. So I'm going to edit this all together into one. I don't even remember where I was going with all of this, but basically the screens need to be very workable. It needs to be able to work at relatively close distances. When we get into the higher brightnesses, you have to move away from the Neo, but this is a review of the Neo. I've been using this since I put the theater together. It's been in here operational for at least a year, maybe going on a year and a half now. And we've used JVC and Christie projectors on it. I haven't put any others on this in my room. We've used lots of other Barcos, Sonys, you name it, with these in other rooms. But in my room, those are the two projector brands we've used. It's looked great with both. As I mentioned before, sometimes screens can be a problem where with lower brightness projectors, you don't notice it and everything's fine. And then you get into these really high brightness, high-end projectors, and all of a sudden you start to see some issues. It also can be exacerbated by the fact that those projectors may be sharper, and so some of the flaws become more audible. Typically the Christie and Barco projectors, because they're DLP, because the lenses are better, those two things combined tend to lead to a sharper image and show flaws. The other issue, of course, is that sometimes DLP projectors can have issues with rainbow effect, which certain screens can make worse than others. And then with lasers, there can also be, specifically with tri-laser, not laser phosphor, that can be something called laser speckle, and you can see that. Now, I don't appear to be sensitive to any of this stuff, so for what that's worth, I didn't notice any of those issues with this screen with these projectors, either because I'm not sensitive to it or because this screen and projector combination worked really well. Can't say. What I can say is that it looked beautiful. I really loved the image I saw with those Christie projectors. I've liked my JVC since I got it. Wish it was brighter, but otherwise it's a very good projector. And the screen has always been great. The screen I had before this for myself personally was actually a spandex screen. And what I can tell you is, compared to the spandex screen, so the spandex screen actually has some positives to it. It is extremely acoustically transparent. It's a great material for that purpose. And you can get a white that is close enough to a neutral white that it can be corrected for, and it works well. The problem is the reflectivity off of that screen is extremely poor. So whereas this one has a gain of around 0.9, those tend to have a gain somewhere between like 0.5 and 0.7, 0.7 being if you're lucky and using like a couple layers of white. And that was using the really heavy duty. So the stuff I used, I think, was actually designed for football outfits. It's that really thick white spandex, which is closer to what this is. I don't know that this is spandex, but it kind of reminds me a little bit of that. So the spandexy materials tend to work well for what they are, but you've got that problem of they just don't tend to have the gain that you need to be bright enough. And then, of course, you need a nice frame and things like that. In my case, I actually had an old frame left over from another projection screen I was using that I didn't like the material. And actually, the material was damaged. It had been damaged in shipping. I did compare this actually with a couple of other materials because you can change out the material that's in this with other materials. And I happen to have gotten some, and I wish I could tell you the name. I am forgetting off the top of my head what it's called, but it's this one that I believe it's also made in England. It is a white surface on the front and a black surface on the back that are actually bonded together in some way. And they didn't used to sell it with frames. I think you can buy it with frames now, maybe not. But we had a piece of it that was slightly stained, and it was bigger than this screen. So I was able to install it temporarily on this screen to see. So what I can tell you is this is much more acoustically transparent than that screen is. That screen is a very good screen for picture quality. I believe that it's at least as bright as this one is, if not a little bit brighter, gain-wise. So at least a 0.9, I think, as well. The bonded black backing is nice in that you get that kind of all built in one, and it's together, so there's no chance of a shadow. One of the problems with the black backings is that they aren't as black as velvet. And so when you get like a JVC, you're not putting enough nits on the screen to see this kind of shadow re-reflection that can happen. But when you're putting 300 plus nits on the screen, that tiny little 1 millimeter gap between the two materials can actually be enough to cause another reflection off of the black material that's not as bright, but it can sometimes be visible, especially with movement. And that's been a problem in the past with other screens. Now, I have not had that issue with the Christies. I will say I prefer to make the whole wall black and use black velvet and then not use the black backing, and it seems to work okay, but there are scenarios where we can't do that, and then you use the black backing. This other material that competes has it already bonded, and there's no chance of that shadow. The problem is the acoustic transparency of that material wasn't as good as this, to the point that it actually needed a lot of correction, maybe more than would typically be possible. Remember that it's not just about the correction, it's about whether the speaker can handle it. If it's knocking 9 dB off at 10 kilohertz, for instance, and you add back 9 dB, does the speaker have the actual output headroom to handle 9 dB of boost? In the vast majority of systems, the answer is no. And so we actually have blown speakers before doing that. So I had a project years and years ago where it was not this material, it was something else, but it was just an acoustically transparent fabric screen they were KEF speakers, and the integrator, this wasn't my project, I came in later to fix the problem. The integrator had put the grills over the speakers. So the grills have a little bit of loss to them. Then the screen goes over, it's got a little bit more loss. Let's just say that each one has like 3 dB. Odyssey was automatically compensating for that. When Odyssey automatically compensated, every time you would do like an REW sweep even, it would blow the tweeter. Like it didn't take much. Movies blew the tweeter, you name it. And nobody could figure out what was wrong. I got in there and then I took a look at the transfer function of the correction, and it was obvious that there was 6. In fact, I think at some frequencies there was as much as 12 dB. There was a couple of areas where they'd done like a ton of boost, more than I even realized Odyssey could do. And it was blowing, it was actually clipping the amplifier during sweeps when you did them pretty loud, and it was blowing the tweeter every time. So the fix actually was pretty simple. By taking the black backing off and taking the grills off, there was enough reduction in loss that once everything was corrected, it was not an issue. This was, I say many years ago, this predates when the app and the PC software were available, and there was no way to adjust how it handled the correction. And we had tried to compensate for it using various mechanisms, but none of them worked. So ultimately, this was the fix, and it worked okay. But my point with all this is that a lot of you would be in a situation where the speakers you have behind the screen wouldn't have the headroom to handle the amount of boost you would need if you used a screen that had a lot of loss on it. And I will show the measurements from this one, and if I can, I'll see if I can show the measurements. The problem with that, when I have samples of this, I don't have samples of the other one, and I have a frame that I put my samples in for measurements, and I can't put that into the frame because it's a whole screen, so I'd have to figure out what I'm going to do. If I can figure out how to do this, I will test it. I don't test on this because that doesn't work. Something else I'll mention about the test data. So as I mentioned with mine, with no black backing, there's only about a dB or so, maybe 2 dB at some frequencies of loss. At the highest of frequencies, it's probably a little bit more than that, but it's in the neighborhood of that. Other people have done these tests and they tend to do it incorrectly. So these types of materials, these woven materials, are not self-supporting. Because of that, the material has to be stretched. Otherwise, the pores will be right on top of each other because it's a stretchy material. So think about spandex. If you take it and you pull, or even grill cloth for that matter, if you take it and you blow through it and then you pull it and you blow through it, the pores get bigger and the air goes through more easily. You cannot test this by just laying it over a speaker. That doesn't work. It needs to be properly stretched. And actually, the way that it should be stretched is the way that you would do stretch fabric. So you actually need to have a frame that can equally tension it in all directions so that you get nice equal pull. I've seen this tested in a couple of ways, most if not all of which are not correct. So first, I see it very commonly laid over the top of the speaker. If this is that material that is the self-supporting type material, such as what's used in the outdoor screens that I mentioned, that works okay because no matter how much you stretch it, it doesn't change the pore size. But for this material, that doesn't work. The other one I've seen is people take clips, and they take some sort of a frame and they put it around it and they clip it. That doesn't do equal tension, and so what can happen is you can get areas where you actually get squishing of the pores and then pulling of the pores, and so it too may not be acoustically transparent as much as it really would be. My frame is actually a mini screen. Chris made it for me, so it's a mini screen made out of screen-like materials with actual track, the exact same track he uses. And as a result of that, when I put the fabric in, I can do equal tensioning so that when I test it, I'm able to test how it would perform in a correct environment. The only thing about it you could argue is it's not big enough, but I just don't have the ability to deal with bigger ones. So to keep the frame fully out of the measurements, ideally you'd want a frame that's probably close to the size of a real screen, and you'd want to stick that in an anechoic chamber. I can't do that. It's just not a realistic way for me to do testing. So what I've got is something that's a couple of feet by a couple of feet. I think it's 2.5 by 2 or something like that. And that's enough that as long as I keep the microphone relatively close and the speaker relatively close, I can get a good assessment of what the material is like. And actually, that's sort of a worst case scenario, because if we're talking about 6 inches or so between the speaker and the screen material, you're getting more of the problems that you would get. and then the microphone has to be an equal distance roughly. And so I will show the data. I'm actually going to collect new data for this one. I did it. My daughter's science project, some of you saw this, involved testing it, but because I let her do it, there wasn't a lot of effort put into making sure that it was a completely valid scientific test in every way. And while I think the test of this fabric came out correct, the competitor fabrics that I threw in there had some stuff in it that could be correct, but then they're really bad. And I don't think they are. I think that we were getting some reflections I didn't realize. So I'm going to redo all the tests and I'll show you the data and you can see how much loss we're talking about. But as I said, it was just a couple of dB. In some cases, it was virtually nothing. It really was just creating a little bit of comb filtering without any real loss as a result of that. All of that was relatively addressable. And I'll just go back to the original statement here. I always do theaters this way because the sound quality losses you have from putting speakers behind the fabric versus outside of the fabric are not that great. In fact, putting the speakers outside of the fabric has more sound quality compromises than putting it behind the screen, in my opinion. And as I said, that opinion is shared by all the experts I work with. I don't know anybody who disagrees with that other than people that are hardcore video guys without an audio background. So what I can tell you is, you can argue that there's a video loss here, and of course there is. Theaters are full of compromises, but the audio losses are significant enough that for those of us who look at it holistically, they're too great to use a solid screen. And instead we use acoustically transparent screens in all our rooms. And then the key, like I said at the beginning, is you got to find a screen that meets key requirements, that it's correctable, that the picture is good enough, and that the company is a good company to work with, because that actually matters. This screen is a good screen. Acoustically, it's transparent enough that it's correctable. The picture quality is excellent. I find that compared to something like a Studio Tech 100 or a 130, there's an ever so slight softening of it, but it's no worse than anything I've seen on any other AT screen, and under most circumstances, I don't notice it. So when I'm sitting in my chair and I'm watching, and I'm not back to back with something like a Studio Tech 100, an industry standard screen, I would never find there's anything wrong with this. It's perfectly fine. It's only when I get those materials right next to each other that I can see an ever so slight increase in sharpness. And I have a theory, but I could be wrong, that the gain on the Studio Tech 130, it might actually make the image look a little bit punchier. But I mean, I say a theory. Of course it does, because it's got a higher gain to it. But there tends to be darkening of the edges of the screen, which I don't like, whereas this one is completely uniform and you don't have any of those issues. And if you use a bright enough projector, that's not a major concern. So to kind of end this review, I think this is a great screen. I think it's a good company and I highly recommend it. It is who I use in all of my projects, and I really wouldn't switch for anything. They'd have to start putting out garbage for me to switch because, again, I think so highly of the company, but they're not garbage. They're great screens. And from an acoustically transparent standpoint, they're as good as anything I've measured that has sufficiently good quality picture. As I said, there are other people who have done reviews where they've measured them. They've measured them incorrectly. As a result, it's put out the idea that there's these cheap screens that are actually like the best screens on the market. They're not. Unfortunately, those reviews were wrong. The testing was inaccurate. The individuals who did it actually know they're inaccurate at this point, but have chosen not to pull them down because they get a lot of hits, I guess. I don't know. The measurements I'm showing you are accurate, and it shows that this is a solid and good material. So thanks for watching the review. I hope you found this helpful. Keep on watching. Got more content coming.